Serious, soldiers of Reddit who fought in Afghanistan. What preconceptions did you have that turned out to be completely wrong? My perception that was completely wrong is that all the locals hate you and they want to try and kill you 24/7. As I stated, that is completely wrong and it was the opposite of that. The local Afghan population, and ironically the Taliban, were extremely nice to us. They would rather have us there than the Taliban. Where I was stationed was the heroin capital of Afghanistan. I actually believe in the world as well. We were also told that the majority of the Taliban were from this area as well. Because of this, a lot of them didn't want to fight in their own backyards. The locals were happy with us because we kept the peace and helped them out as much as we can in a combat environment. We actually brought an economic boost for them as well. The local shop owners loved us because we would always buy monsters, pop, cigarettes, and chips off of them. We would buy food off of other locals on a weekly basis. Oh yeah, that's another perception I had that was wrong. Those suckers can cook, and I mean cook. They had the best chicken and potatoes and made the best bread. As I stated already, the Taliban soldiers didn't have a problem with us either. There are many times we would hear that the higher up Taliban leaders would call the local guys and flip the frick out on them because they aren't trying to kill us, and the local dudes would just be like, hey man, we're good. They are good. They aren't doing anything to harm us. We just want to chill. They will be gone sooner or later. I'm not crapping you. That's how their conversations went. There would even be times that the Taliban were forced to do their job that they would have other local people place the IEDs and make them so freaking obvious. Like textbook IED laying so we can see it from a mile away so none of us would get hurt and they can pass it on and say they did their job. This was great to write. Thank you for asking. It's pretty rare that someone asks you anything about being in Afghanistan other than did you kill anyone. It's nice to talk about it. Was in the Tangi Valley and we had 2 of our 4 of HMMWVs broke in the middle of a town. The whole village male population came out to help us dig out our vehicles. Talking like 100-200 people who were digging and crap. Right next to us and with us. Sun went down and it started to snow. Everyone left. We got attacked that night. The villagers didn't want us there, not because they hated us, but because they knew their mud huts were about to get fricked up in the attack that would happen that night. Christmas Eve, I think 2010. Soldiers tend to train for fighting at sub 500 meters. At least I always had. Not being able to see the enemy wasn't completely out of the norm for training, but they were usually within the effective range of our small arms. Come to Afghanistan and we were getting fired at by invisible enemies on the side of mountains a kilometer and away. We hardly knew we were getting engaged, let alone went into contact drills. When I was told I was going to Afghanistan, I was picturing mountains and all that stuff they have in the eastern part of the country. I went to southern Afghanistan. It's mostly desert, but around the rivers it's a freaking jungle. I spent many patrols wading through knee to waist deep water and mud in pomegranate and grape orchards. Most of my training leading up to deploying to Afghanistan had been geared towards urban operations and convoy operations. What I ended up doing was small, squad-sized dismounted patrols through rough terrain. Also didn't expect to be as close to the enemy as we usually were. Usually less than 50 meters was our engagement distance. That is interesting. All the Canadian soldiers I have talked to, I am Canadian, have said they rarely even saw the enemy. That must have been nuts. Their concept of food. In their culture, if anyone had food they were to share it with everyone around them. This is even if you only have enough for one person to have a snack. It was almost as if they didn't believe food could be owned by a person. Some of the Afghans I worked with would be offended if I ate anything and didn't offer them some. I guess also that I would actually be working with some Afghans. I didn't expect that to be a thing. I saw this everywhere in developing countries. People who have nothing offering everything they have. To me, it's a sense of community that we have long lost. That Afghanistan was an actual country, it's only so on a map. The people, in some of the more rural places, at least, have no concept of Afghanistan. We were in a village in northern Kandahar province, talking to some people who of course had no idea who we were or why we were there. This was in 2004. Not only had they not heard about 9/11, they hadn't heard Americans had come over. Talking to them further, they hadn't heard about that one time the Russians were in Afghanistan either. We then asked if they knew where the city of Kandahar was, which is a rather large and important city some 30 miles to the south. They'd heard of it, but no one had ever been there, and they didn't know when it was. For them, there was no Afghanistan. The concept just didn't exist. Man, I had some guy think we were still the Russians. LOL. Oh, also about the fighting we did. I had in my mind that it would be these organized ambushes against a somewhat organized force. It may have been like that for the push, Marja, but once the initial defense was scattered, the fighting turned into some farmer getting paid a year's salary to go fire an AK-47 at our patrol as we walked by. I mean, no wonder there was so much PTSD going around. It doesn't feel okay when you killed some farmer for trying to feed his kids or save his family from torture that next night. It feels like crap actually. That we would be fighting the Taliban. The majority of people we managed to detain had been coerced into shooting at us by the Mujahideen, which is made up of all sorts of people who had kidnapped or threatened their family. The most glaring example of this was when our free on board, forward operating base was attacked by a massive VBIED truck bomb that blew a hole in our wall. Suicide bombers ran into the free on board through the hole and blew themselves up in our bunkers. Every single one of them had their hands tied and remote detonation receivers, so they couldn't back out. Edit. Thanks for the gold. Holy heck. You don't hear about that on the news. It really puts things in perspective. That everyone was going to be dirty and poor like in those help a poor starving child commercials. I remember being really surprised to see kids running around playing in dirt roads and everyone was clean. No dirt smudges on their face or anything. Also there were these two little girls with the most unbelievably white dresses I have ever seen standing by the side of the road watching our convoy roll by. Very surreal. Redditor for 4 years and just got my first gold. Thank you very much. Deployed in 2011. My misconception was that we were going to help the Afghans have better lives. Like user Tanner said on here, most of them just wanted to be left alone and didn't care at all about whether they had democracy or the Taliban. We would do anything we could to get people to talk to us and give us any information on the Taliban and Haqqani. Most said nothing, but some were honest. Look, what good will it do me to talk to you? You will leave soon. They will still be here. What are you going to do for me? My brother was kidnapped last week. Have any Americans been doing anything about that? Can you protect me and my family if something happens to us? Can I count on you? Of course. We would try to sound positive and helpful without making promises, and try to act like of course we are here to help you, but protecting Afghan civilians was not the priority. Not that we would intentionally endanger them, but we would never go out of our way just to save or protect a local. Force protection is the name of the game. And I get it. It's the military, not a humanitarian NGO. Certain missions take priority, and you can't risk lives needlessly. I just thought that we might have put more effort into winning trust. There was this police chief in our AO. Police chief in name only. He was effectively a warlord who was fighting the Haqqanis because they killed his son-in-law. He literally told us if he didn't have them to fight, he would fight the Americans just because we were there. I thought that interesting. I'd have to say this is not a perception but rather a culture shock. I was never part of any interrogations, but I was told that some of the Taliban we had been fighting believed we had force fields that were causing their weapons, most notably RPGs, to not hit us. It had nothing to do with skill of the user or the weapon's capabilities. They actually believed our technology was that superior. A lot of these posts project an image that Afghans generally don't support coalition forces, and that their soldiers are completely worthless. While these statements are true to a degree, I think it's unfair for that to be the general consensus. I trained Afghan soldiers regularly, and probably 75% of the time they went on patrols with us in an on-the-job training type fashion. I also spent more time in villages and in the streets than I did on the COP. Our base. You have some villages where the people absolutely loved us, some villages that hated us, Some villages that didn't hate us but didn't support the Taliban and wanted to be left alone. And villages with a mix of all of the above. As for the soldiers, some were completely worthless. They joined because it was a steady paycheck, just like some of our soldiers. Other soldiers were so badass that I wish they could have joined our ranks officially. And of course, most of them were somewhere in between. They receive minimal training to become a soldier. Their infrastructure is weak, and oftentimes they are going out to villages to buy food so they can eat. This is a fault of their government and the higher ups, not of the ranks. I think another important factor to take in is the fact that Afghans have grown up accustomed to war, shooting, bombing, landmines, airstrikes, tanks, Humvees, etc. Literally their entire lives. No matter how old they are, they have all lost a family member or friend in a war over the past 30+ years. Us being there isn't something new. That it was really a war. It's just people sustaining other people, with a lot of nothing actually getting done. As someone who was a gunner for most of my tour, we mainly did transportation missions from Kabul to the eastern province. We never saw any action, and to this day I thank God for that. The fact that a lot of my time outside of convoys was spent either sleeping, eating, or gaming surprised me, I suppose, but in the end, we're just there to provide presents, and not expected to actually accomplish anything. The amount of awards given out back in Kabul for people simply hitting a high quota of maintenance repairs threw me off too. There were times when I was looked down upon for not working every day in a shop and instead being on convoys. The worst part of it all was losing a friend to suicide after returning home safe. That was something I never expected to see happen, and it still messes with me to this day. I've been to 11 other countries during my 5 years in the Marines. Went there expecting the people to be chanting for our death and plotting nefarious acts of villainy all the time. Which, certainly, there are a few out there. For the most part though, people the world over are the same with minor outliers. Afghanis are not an exception here. They mostly just want to be left alone, tend their land and their family. They are almost exactly the same as anyone who grew up in the deep south. Just a different flavor of religion. Most interesting to me is how their history is passed down each generation. It's all word of mouth, for generation after generation, and largely focused on the wars they fought. The end result is you'll have elders in the mountains who'll swear that their great-great-grandfather fought against Alexander the Great. For the most part though, people the world over are the same with minor outliers. I wish more people actually understood this. That they had any idea why we were there. We'd ask them if they knew what 9/11 was, and they had no idea. We'd show them pictures of the WTC on fire after the planes hit, and ask them what it was. Their response was usually that it was a picture of a building the US bombed in Kabul, their capital. Kind of mind-blowing that they're being occupied by a foreign military force and have no idea why. Can't verify this story as it came to me indirectly, but I heard of an Australian SF patrol that went out into the mountains and came across an isolated Afghan village. They thought the newcomers were the Soviets. No idea that one war had ended and another one had started. I served in both Iraq and Afghanistan. 2 BCT, 101st Airborne 2004 to 2009. One preconception I had prior to arriving was that the whole country was a shithole. Afghanistan had some of the most beautiful landscapes and views I have ever had the pleasure of enjoying that would give our earthborn an orgasm. The people there are simple, farming and hunting gathering type folk, and when introduced to money they became extremely selfish. I remember reading about the $1 million reward originally offered for Bin Laden. They asked Afghan farmers what they'd do with that much money. Most couldn't even understand the concept, and the ones who did wanted simple things like 2 goats or a balloon for their daughter. Alright, so after 8 my first duty station was Qatar. I got there in the middle of the night, got picked up and got a room. The next day I started in processing and met with my new CO and 1 SG, which is when I get informed that I won't be staying in Qatar. Instead, I will be going to Afghanistan. So there I am, 20 years old in Qatar. I don't know anyone and all I have is my uniforms and personal belongings. Getting told I'm going to Afghanistan the next day. I got my Ach and Iba that day, but was told I would get the rest of my gear including my weapon in Afghanistan. I was absolutely terrified. I was expecting crap like you see on TV where the Taliban is constantly attacking and shooting at you. I got to Bagram and it's a huge freaking airfield. Calm as can be. There are stores and restaurants and civilians everywhere and nobody gives a frick. I get to Kabul and it's the same thing. There were kids playing soccer right outside the Kabul airport, though the airport has since become more secure. I got a custom tailored suit there and even went back as a contractor after I finished my 4 years. Afghanistan was not nearly as terrifying as I thought. Kabul looked like a war-torn and impoverished featuring Collins Company. There were apartment complexes, restaurants, billboards for colleges, trucking companies, etc. Most of the LNs didn't give a frick about the war, they gave a frick about providing for themselves. I was in 3rd BDE, 1st Infantry Div. From 2007 to 2012, I went to the Nangarhar and Kaus provinces, 0809 and 2011. I was in Afghanistan when they killed Osama and we went out on a patrol the next day to ask the locals what they thought. The vast majority of locals didn't even know or care who Bin Laden was. The majority of the locals I came in contact with either liked us or were indifferent. The only ones that openly didn't like us were the ones that shot at us. Bastards. As far as answering your question OP, everything. I went in with a ton of preconceived notions as to what the country, people, atmosphere, climate and landscape would be like. The living conditions my first deployment were about what I figured they'd be and nothing could have prepared me for my second deployment. The landscape was a mix between desert, high desert and farmlands. I spent a bit of time in some mountains and holy frick were they the steepest most inhospitable mountains I've ever seen. The people were mostly friendly, they'd offer you food and chai even if they were dirt poor farmers, which most of them were. I would love to go back and visit as a civilian and I hope that one day the country is safe enough that I can. What threw me off most when I first got there was the horrendous stench. If you've never been to a third world country, you just can't imagine the smell. There are no sewers, just open ditches that carry all the human waste and run through the city's towns. Villages usually have a 3-wall compound about the size of the average American bedroom that the whole village uses to poop in. That or they poo in their fields for fertilizer. Add ungodly heat and humidity and the smell just permeates everything. My mom said she could smell the poo on my uniforms when I came home for R&R. Combat is nothing like I thought it would be. It's not well organized, fluid movements like in the movies. It's chaos. Pure, unadulterated havoc. Especially in Afghanistan when you don't always know where you're getting shot at from. Everyone just picks a spot on a mountain that looks probably and opens up. Then we called in the CAS CCA, Apaches, Kawas, A-10s, and let them end the fight for us. Maybe about half the time we had no idea where it was coming from and the other half they were smart enough to stay out of range of our M4S and 249S. That left only the two 240s to engage and the rest of us would just spot for them. Then there was the rare occasion where they fricked up and attacked us while we were mounted. Freaking .50 cal and MK19 opening up on those bastards and those firefights never lasted long. However bad you think the terrain might be, it's worse. We are talking mountains, like the Rocky Mountains type terrain. Imagine trying to go to the Rockies and fight the indigenous people there. Now add on top of that the fact that you are a foreigner who doesn't know their language, customs, traditions, or jack crap about them. Now try to win their hearts and minds. Another part is how amazing the views are. The world truly is missing out on Afghanistan's beauty. It's shocking how pure and beautiful the landscape is. They have a serious tourism goldmine they are sitting on. I'm talking about Maine, the north and east of the country. Frick the south, it's just crappy all around. You hear so much about how different Afghans and Afghani culture is before you go that you forget that they're just people too. The kids especially. Kids everywhere are pretty much the same. I don't feel too bad about leaving the crappy, lazy AMF guys to their fate, but I still wonder about the little kids I used to watch play from our guard tower. I expected that during the winter the weather would be nice because it's like a barren desert, right? All the training was done during the hot but summer in the deserts of California. So what a relief we would be deploying during the winter. Frick no, it gets cold as crap. So my deployment to Afghanistan was a psyop. We were very restricted in the messaging we could do and the methods we could use. One example would be that we would provide tip lines for people to call in to report weapons caches or militants. To distribute those numbers we would put them on handbills and give them to people. Alteri Taliban would just set up a checkpoint and search people. He finds a tip line in your phone or a handbill on you or in your belongings, he just kills you on the spot and makes sure people know why he did it. They had a better psyop program than we did. That people aren't grateful for our presence. It's just like here, some support, others do not. I was in the far eastern part of Afghanistan, about 2 miles from the Pakistani border near the federally administered tribal zones. Most were happy for the help in this remote region. It's the bread and butter of recruitment for certain organizations. These individuals have zero contact with the outside world. Zero. News takes a while to reach. For example, when that guy in Florida burned a Quran, we knew instantly, but they didn't find out until 4 months later from word of mouth. As an American who grew up in the rural South, I could identify with that to some degree, but it was a whole new ballgame just how isolated it was. Popular preconception is that it'll be hot as heck. Certain areas are, but I was 6,500 feet up in the mountains, so when I arrived the 8th of January of 2011, there were 3 feet of snow on the ground. It was cold as frick. They have cell phones and their own cell towers and such. We helped them set them up as part of ancillary missions. I didn't know we did that before I came. Finally, the interpreters, ours, I forgot his name, lived in South Carolina. He was a young boy when the Russians invaded, but was in his late 30s or mid to late 40s. Looked way older than he probably was, but was just as passionate about being an American as anyone I'd ever met. So proud that he signed up when the war broke out to come back and be an interpreter. So, lesson here is, interpreters aren't just random locals like I thought they'd be. Another lesson on loyalty. Near my cop, there was a man and a family that lived on a nearby hilltop. He'd come into the free on board and take the garbage out, arrange help when we needed it, and so on, and was very supportive. An agency contacted him asking about information on us. He refused, and for his loyalty, was given his son in small pieces in a garbage bag on his front porch. We relocated him and his family for protection, but I couldn't even imagine the pain he must have felt. So, certain Afghans have given up a great amount for our country's war effort, however misguided one may think it is. Their sacrifices are not minute. Crap lakes exist. That's about all I have for now, but any other questions, I'd love to answer them. They told us we were going to fight the Taliban. Turns out, there is no way to know who is Taliban, or what Taliban is, or what they look like. A guy will be bringing his kid to your clinic one day, then shooting at you the next. You'll make friends with a kid on an airdrop, then see that kid slit another kid's throat on patrol a week later. There is no enemy and no goal. The people don't even understand who you are or why you're there. Many of them believed we were invulnerable demons. One elder tested this theory by sending a small child to try and stab me in the back with a knife, which was made by welding a blade onto an old .50 cal casing. Kids dig up mines, bouncing batties, and old Russian munitions and set them off like firecrackers. The place is a fricked up maelstrom with no conceivable sense of morality, justice, benevolence, or community. Every single person is just trying to survive. I thought that bad guys stood out. I know it seems weird, but if I walk down the street in America and I use my stereotyping radar, I think I can pick out a few bad apples and feel confident about my choices. Over there, where all the faces, expressions and mannerisms were different, I really had to change my preconceived notions about what a bad guy could possibly be. The nice guy who made me feel at ease because he spoke decent English and helped me learn a few useful phrases in Pashto turned out to be Taliban. And the cute kid I gave candy and school supplies to was bringing contraband onto the base. However, the smelly dirty guy who always looked like he was seconds away from attempting to murder me turned out to be the one with the useful information, and he wore that death stare because he knew just how much his life was in danger on a daily basis and how many of the other locals would be willing to turn him over to the Taliban in a heartbeat. I guess it really taught me to always be on guard, because every time I felt like I had judged someone appropriately, something happened that made me throw my preconceived ideas about them out of the window. It's so weird being engaged in war but at the same time being over there staring an enemy combatant in the eye and never even knowing it. I thought I was going to get closer to why I had joined, to defend the US. Was I encountered was confusion, corruption and waste. It was demoralizing to see so much money and so many lives were being spent. Specifically in my case, I was in a unit doing the same job as someone already there. It looked like the whole unit mission was created to give someone a chance to be a combat experienced general. Had some remote groups of Afghans think we were Russian. Didn't even know Russia had left years ago and they were now at war with America. How much the locals help. Most of the construction, cleanup, and other non-military jobs are done by locals. Our culture rubbed off on them too. There were these two local guys who drove the tanker truck that sucked up all the waste out of the portage johns. One would sit in the truck and the other would run the hose into the toilet hole. I once saw them arguing in their own language about who would run the hose this time, and they settled on paper, rock, scissors. Then, in perfect English, one of them says, "Okay, but none of this best of 3 bulls." This is by far my favorite anecdote. I expected it to be desert like Iraq. I was wrong. Spent 9 months literally on the side of a mountain. My first step in Afghanistan was onto ice, where I slipped and fell. Many others did as well. Good times. Also, I thought the war was mostly over with and that the media only caught the worst of what was going on. Wrong on that part as well. Not that the following was a preconception, but I failed to understand the severity of illiteracy in both language and math. When I was in Kandahar province in 2009, we had an old man come up to my platoon looking for the medic. He proceeded, through a terp, to tell our medic that his granddaughter had a severely injured arm. When the medic asked about the time frame in which it happened, the old man entered into a 5-minute discussion with the terp, where they finally guessed that it was between 2 and 3 moons previous. The medic couldn't even rely on that info since the old man could only count 1, 2, and many. The sad thing was that the medic figured it was just her broken arm to begin with, but then it healed in a way that she could not ever straighten it or bend it further without surgery, resulting in lifelong struggle. That was a big sad point on that tour. Poverty, linked with lack of medical care, coupled with sheer ignorance. My second tour was on a training mission in Kabul, where I learned the true impact of illiteracy. When all the men cannot tell time, there are only 2 times a day that can be even remotely expected for people to understand: sunrise and sunset. Some could argue midday, but that is harder to estimate. Even then, it could be give or take an hour on either side, mostly on the later. Our Western militaries were trying to train an army of men who couldn't count past 3. So how can you teach them a grid system on a map? How to set the sights on their rifle? Communicate distance? Keep track of men and equipment? Accurately count pay and cut down on corruption? How about writing notes? Checking regulations? Counting ammo? Counting if 140 men in the company are actually present? Men would run away all the time and it would be days before their cock ever knew. I ask that anyone reading this should try to conduct an hour of their life without reading or counting a thing. Now try to do your job without it. It is next to impossible. So now you can understand how hard it is to train the ALA and ANP. Their lack of motivation and apathy aside. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.